Okay.
Very
Okay,
good.
thanks, Mike.
Right. Well, yeah. We wanted to start then with a bit more sort of autobiographical on your part. How did you become a language person? How did you become interested in languages? From school onwards, perhaps? And just tell us a bit about that aspect to begin with.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I mean, this is an interesting question that makes you dig around in your past, doesn't it? It's very, very interesting. I mean, it was interesting reading what Eric Hawkins said. I mean, I was the first in the family to stay on school beyond the age of 16. And because I'd passed my 11 plus, I went to a grammar school over in actually Wigan, over there, until I moved to Sheffield 2.5 years later, where it became comprehensive, but I was still in the grammar school stream. So because I went to the grammar school, of course, I started to learn languages. So not only, first generation university, but first generation post 16 and doing languages. And, it was a very working class, very supportive background. I didn't travel. We only had holidays in England. So, and I very often wondered why it was that I ended up doing languages, given that background. I very often tell my students it's thanks to a cheese poster that was next on the wall next to my desk. And there was one of those posters with loads of pictures of different cheeses that used to fascinate me because I'd never seen cheese with, a white crust, for example. It doesn't fascinate people anymore, does it? Because they can get it all the time. But for me, it was, I was just really interested. I think that was sort of symbolic of just being fascinated by the differences. When I eventually went on a school trip to France, I was looking at those old, the De Chevaux, the old Citroën, that looked like tin cans. I found all of that fascinating, and I just really, really, really loved it. I wasn't particularly interested in the grammatical side of it. I don't think I was particularly good at languages, although the teacher seemed to give everybody 7 out of 10, and we never knew how to get more than that. So it just, whatever, out of 10. I mean, I remember doing this exercise and getting them all wrong, because I think it was to do with the direct object agreement in French, but I had no idea what a direct object was because we'd only done nouns and verbs and adverbs. I went to a grammar school, so I mean, it was those kind of cultural differences, more than similarities in those days, of course, that just really, really fascinated me. So in my school, I mean, I started with French, the second year we did Latin. The third year, halfway through, as I say, I went to Sheffield, joined a class that had also started German in the third year. So it was February, I had to catch up. And interestingly, in the fourth year, I opted to do French, German, and Latin. So I did 3 languages. Meant that I couldn't do lots of other things that I might have done. But, I think that was also something to do with my parents just said, do whatever you're interested in. There was no grand plan. I mean, I never thought about what subjects I should do to become an astrophysicist or something, because I had no idea that those things existed. So I did the things that I enjoyed, and there were languages, and I liked geography because it was about different places. And then I did French, German, and English and general studies A levels, and I did Spanish O level as well in the 6th form. So it was obvious I was going to go into languages at university. But yeah, I mean, it was, I think Eric said, you know, it was a way of kind of escaping. I wasn't doing that. I actually liked these kind of parallel existences of being in my lovely home with my family, but at the same time having this other life. Probably wanted to be a superhero or something, you know, I don't know. But it was just really exciting. I just found it, and I still do, you know, I'm always love being in other countries because it's just, I'm a rubbish tourist because I want to be part of it. But I think, you know, it's those cultural elements. So then I went to do languages. I did a language degree at Aston, French and German. And did a bit of Italian, but not much. And that's really when I started traveling other than school trips, because then obviously at the end of my first year, I spent a month in Heidelberg. That was my first time in Germany at the end of my first year. And it was, I remember seeing things thinking, oh, it really is used, because it had just been, you know, something on paper. And I did my year abroad in Zurich, of all places. So I also learned that there were things like language varieties that I thought, well, here I am learning German, but I can't understand a word. But it was fascinating as well to learn that. Yeah, so that's, I suppose, my language history up to that point. But it was certainly this fascination with being somewhere where it was different and where I was different from everything else as well. So, you know, that's what it felt like. Of course, when you spend time, then you realize there's more things in common than that are different.
When you say Aston, Aston was a little bit of a different from many traditional literature language courses.
Yeah.
Was that a specific? Was that a, you know, a conscious choice, or?
It was, yeah. Because I'd asked people and I'd looked at prospectuses, and what I found out was that you know, you could go to many other universities and do lots of literature, which I loved. I mean, you know, I actually was very good at literature, English literature, and the French and the German. But I wanted to learn to communicate. I wanted to really learn the language, and I had this, you know, worry that I'd go and I'd read things in translation and write my stuff in English, and the language bit might not get me as far as I wanted to be. So I've no idea where that came from, but it was, it may be that I remember when I used to go to France, because I didn't go to Germany when I was at school, I used to be surprised that I couldn't say anything, because, you know, I could describe the mountains and the flowers, but I couldn't actually do anything. I said this in my PGCE interview, actually, and I didn't realize it was a great thing to say, but I just said, you know, well, I want to teach people to communicate, because I couldn't when I was learning it. I could produce beautiful French, but I couldn't actually buy a loaf of bread. Well, at least not until I'd done the conditional tense, which was for some time.
Sounds familiar.
So, you know, that's how I entered the teaching profession, with that kind of aspiration. And I think that's why, even in school, why I wanted to go somewhere where I really learned the language. And it was great because, of course, you know, it was a bit of a shock to arrive on day one at a lecture in French linguistics, for them to start speaking French, you know, and all of the lectures were in French or German. So it was a bit of a shock, but it was great. And then just learning how to do different, you know, use language in different ways as well, looking, you know, at registers. And we had you know, assignments like, you know, you're writing an editorial for Le Monde, or it could have been humanity, you had a choice, and then you had to write something that fitted that particular style. So I don't think I could do it now, but we learned how to do those things. So it was really, really great. Yeah, so that's why I chose to go to Aston, really. And of course, lots and lots of speaking, and we did translation, interpreting, and things. I think I didn't want to be a teacher.
Ah, right. Now, that leads us on then to the next point.
Yeah.
How did you become, or what made you become a languages teacher? Or maybe we should go back a step and say, well, so what did you want to do with your languages when you left university?
I wanted to do something that involved travel, because I'd learned that I loved being in other places. I thought of things like international banking, diplomatic service, these sorts of things. So I kind of wanted to do something like that. My year abroad, I didn't go as an assistant. I was a student at the interpreters school that was in Zurich at the time. I mean, that was a possibility until I realized that I didn't like doing it. Because all you could do was say what somebody else was saying, and you couldn't say anything that you wanted to say. And it was stressful. So yeah, but then in the end, I think it was also partly in the end, I wanted to know what I was going to be doing in September before I finished. And other people when the university was saying, oh, well, we'll decide on what we're going to do and we'll apply for jobs at the end, when we finished. And I had so many cousins unemployed, so many in my family unemployed. I mean, this was the late 70s, that I just didn't want that. So I applied for an MA at LSE in European politics and institutions, because I'd done a lot of politics at Aston as part of the degree. And I applied for PGCE. And I got a place at LSE, but no funding, so I couldn't do that. So I did the PGCE and loved it, so it was fine.
Where was that? Where was that?
At that point, I then, in my final year, chose the options, the literature options, and I got the best marks in my degree for doing the literature options. I loved it. But by then, I'd done lots of other things, so it was fine.
Well, where did you do your PGC then?
Durham.
Ah, yes, of course you did that.
Gillian
well, before my time with Gillian.
For your time.
Yeah, with Gillian.
Gillian.
Okay.
Yes, with Gillian. Yeah, so Gillian's the one that interviewed me. And we're still in touch.
Good, that's great. I didn't know that. Yeah. So that's how you then became a language educationist as opposed to a language, something else professional, interpreter or international banking or diplomat or whatever. And that then, well, that's where maybe we can talk a bit about, and where maybe Alan would ask you a bit more about, the language teaching part of your career or your life.
Shall I pick it up there, Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who stopped me?
You had a very varied career in different locations. I mean, the contrast between London, which I think must have been in Ilia days, and then Derbyshire, although you're already familiar with the north, must have been something. We can come on to your higher education and your career and your views about language teaching later. But looking at from a teacher's point of view, what were the significant moments when you were in schools or just after that you had an impact on you and took things forward in the profession? Just two or three things to get us started, maybe.
Fine. I mean, I gave it some thought and realised it's what I've actually written, I think, in my bio on my website, because I'd reflected on this. I mean, I moved to London to teach in 1979 because I knew it was going to be a cosmopolitan, multilingual place. So I was very excited about that. I was then slightly surprised when I found that nobody was particularly interested in the multilingualism in education that was there, you know, whilst we were kind of, you know, killing ourselves trying to motivate children to learn certain languages, that we weren't that bothered at the fact that some could speak many languages. So that was a bit of a surprise. But that's why I went to London. And also because they, you know, they had cafes that spilled out onto the pavement, which I was missing in Sheffield at the time, although we have them round the corner from my house now. So yeah, I mean, you know, the question reminds me of a question that Sue Pryor, she was an ILEA inspector, asked me after about a year of teaching, and she's at some kind of training thing, some inset. And she said, Terry, what are your things? What are your specialisms? And I thought, I haven't a clue what I mean, I'm still, you know, I've only been teaching a few months. I'm trying to control my classes. You know, what are they? But, you know, she asked me 5 years later, I would have said what I'm going to say now, which is really that they were about learner autonomy. And they were about, I didn't know it was about learner autonomy because I've never heard of it until 10 years later, but learner autonomy and multilingualism and with language awareness. And which, of course, remain my areas of academic work now. So all of my work that I do at university really is informed by my time in school and my experiences in school. And of course, both of those areas were really I was approaching them from a social inclusion angle. So if you want me to say a bit more, I can say a bit more about each one, if you've got time. I mean, the learner autonomy is what I eventually call flexible learning. And that was really about differentiation for me. You know, in a class there, we had all kinds of abilities, as we call them, and not a lot of motivation always. So it was thinking about how to differentiate so that everyone could be involved in the lessons and be motivated. Now, differentiation was something I'd done some work on in my PGCE, and Gillian Donmore had moved to King's when I moved to London. So she used to invite me in to talk to PGCE students. And I remember doing sessions on differentiation. Yeah, so I tried all kinds of things. I was doing carousels, for example, in the 80s, until I realized they were quite fun as one-offs, but they weren't really differentiation because they were still all doing the same thing, just not at the same time. What I didn't want was the kind of, you know, death by worksheet where you just give them loads of worksheets. Because of my commitment, I suppose, to communication, then I wanted them to carry on with the speaking and the listening and not do what, you know, a lot of people out of desperation did, which was go into a class they didn't want to have all the worksheets out and tell them to get on with them. And they'd either be, you know, sort of develop in difficulty or whatever. I just developed these kinds of different approaches to that with students having some kind of choice, but in a very rudimentary way. And this was all the way through my time in London, and then continued when I moved to Derbyshire in 1990, to move back to Sheffield and got a job in Derbyshire at Belper School. And continued to do this, but in a more strategic way, that was triggered by an accident, really, because I can remember teaching my class, I planned my lesson to use all these different resources, but a particular book as well, and got to the stock room and they weren't there. So people hadn't brought them back, of course. So I had to improvise, and I couldn't get a full set of the book, so I had to get what there was, and there would be like 5 of this or whatever. And I put the tasks up, and I told the class to do these tasks. We did some speaking, we did some listening. You can do these tasks, but you can't do them all in the same order because there aren't enough books. So you could do them in any order. And it was a year 10 class. I think we would call them year 10 by then. And I just remember this colleague walking through, because you had to always walk through classrooms to get anywhere, and kind of doing a double take and saying, "Terry, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean they're doing this thing? But, you know, there weren't enough books." He said, "But yeah, they're all working." And it was true. They were all just focused. And it was quite a tough class, because I actually found Belper kids harder than London. I knew how to get London kids to do things, and they seemed a bit more open to, different things. And in Belper, they thought I was weird because I was traveling from Sheffield to Belper every day. But they weren't that keen. I got the job. There was, I think, the GCSE results that had a 9% grade C and above. This was my 3rd head of department job. So I think that's why I got the job, to try and turn that around. But anyway, I thought about it, and actually what I realized was it was the fact that even though it wasn't particularly differentiated, other than there were different resources, they were allowed to choose what they did in the sequence. It was only the sequence, but somehow or other it gave them a bit of control. So we developed that then quite systematically into a flexible learning system with a range of resources, and where they could make choices and they could choose to do listening, and we had the headsets and they had to form groups or pair work, and it was quite complex.
Yeah. And were you able to carry colleagues with you on this once they got over the shock?
Yeah, yes, because they could see well, I kind of snowballed it, but they could see. I mean, that teacher said, "Oh, I want to do whatever it is you're doing, because my class, my equivalent class, I can't do a thing with them." And so that's how it started. So we started to think about how to do that.
Yeah.
I learned so many things, because I remember that same class when I tried something then with some different activities on a sheet, and they had to go and get whichever skill, and it was chaos, because they obviously I hadn't written the instructions clearly. They weren't used to it. They were used to being told what to do, and so they were just coming up saying, "What am I supposed to do with this?" So, "Have you read it?" "No, but what am I supposed to do?" So I had to, we learned a lot of lessons like that, I think, in the process. And what we also learned was that we needed to do that from year 7, from them coming into the school.
Yeah.
Because that would then develop what they'd been doing. They were used to moving around and getting things in primary, and then they'd come in secondary. We'd sit them in their rows, or they didn't have rows in Belper, but still, they were just told, and teachers had their rules.
Yeah.
Know what I mean? I remember, this big panic about, do I have to underline my title or not? Because Mr. Suchbody said I shouldn't, and somebody did. "What do you want?" I said, "I don't really care if you underline, as long as you make it neat so I can read it." You know, for me, you know, it didn't really matter. But there was lots of that. I remember a child asking, right at the very first week or so, or a couple of weeks, they didn't do a lot of writing, but I remember them saying, I've reached the bottom of my page, sir. What do I do? And I said, turn over? Yeah, but where do I write? I said, on the next page. And what I found out from him basically was that he had a teacher that didn't allow them to write on that left side. They always had to write on the right side of the double page.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know, maybe they thought they couldn't write neatly on that side because you could see the imprint from the, I don't know, but it was all these silly rules, you know, so they had to learn to kind of think for themselves from that coming in. So,
Okay.
so that's what we did, and really it was that was the last school I taught in before I went to Nottingham, but it worked. And I remember the first year that had started like that, by the time they did their GCSEs, we had 75% passing. And the year after, by which time I'd gone, I knew that they were in their 80s, was the percentage of getting A's to C.
So the investment was worthwhile.
The investment was worthwhile. And of course, before that, they'd already improved because we'd done other things as well. I mean, I'm saying it's entirely to do with that, but there was a big leap with those.
Yeah, perhaps we could widen to the wider language scene in a moment, Terry. But Mike, do you want to come in on anything Terry said?
Well, I was wondering
before we do.
Yeah, I was wondering. I was interested, first of all, how the cultural as opposed to the linguistic, if I can put it in that contrast, interested you originally. In passing, you mentioned language awareness, and Gillian Dunmore was involved in that, and in fact, so was I. We were on the same committee at one stage at SILT. So language awareness is sort of more, in inverted commas, grammatical or language orientated, as opposed to cultural orientated, and grammatical as opposed to communicative. I wondered what you did with respect to language awareness as such.
The language awareness that I did was focusing more on valuing multilingualism rather than linguistic elements. So they would compare languages and they'd learn about language families, but it was that aspect of language awareness.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, no, I'd been with Gillian, so I knew something about it, but I just was shocked in my second school where I had a class and none of the names were sort of British names, apart from one, who was a girl from Afro-Caribbean background. And I just remember naively asking, oh, how many of you are bilingual? And a stupid thing to ask, I know, but it was 1982, I was being naive. And none of them putting their hands up. And I couldn't understand why, because I heard them speaking other languages. So I then, already then started to do some things in my PSE lessons, but also at the start of the day. And I did find that changed their perspective quite significantly, to the point that I'm doing it with other classes where there was a bit more of a mix, but it did change. It kind of opened their minds. And I remember trying it again. I said, how many of you speak other languages? A couple of months later, and most of them put their hands up. I wanted to say something, so I thought there's something. And one boy put his hand up, and I thought, I don't know what about him speaking other languages. And so I just said, which ones do you speak? And I can remember him sitting there. And then he I wish I hadn't asked him because he looked a bit embarrassed because he said, well, I don't actually, but my brother's sister does. And to me, that just seemed like suddenly it had become something to aspire to. Yeah. So for me, it was the motivation element. And I did my MA in urban education at King's with Gillian as well, and Jeff Whitty. And then I also worked on carousels. So, I mean, carousels in the sense of they in my next school, as I had a department where they did half the year in French, say, and half the year German, and then repeated it, and then they could choose which one they did. And that worked in terms of they chose which language to do in the third year. And we had many more continuing in the fourth year because they'd made a choice. Again, it was this is all the autonomy stuff. I didn't realize then what it was, but I now know. So those sorts of things. And then I moved to a much more multilingual school, actually, very, very diverse in North London. I mean, Greek and Turkish were the main languages, but there were 40 languages, and we actually knew how many there were. There were 40 languages in the school. So I introduced the language awareness into PSHE for all of the tutor groups in the first year, in year 7. It was first year then. And so they all did a module of half a term, once a week, and developed this program, which was really around them using their languages and valuing their languages and letting them hear their languages be used in the classroom. And so that was part of what I did. But and that was, of course, I had to then work with other tutors who weren't linguists. I can remember I had a mathematician, and there was a home economics and others I can't remember. But you know, they thought that there was a language called Indian, you know, until they learned about how to do this. And then they were fascinated, and then they wanted to make their classrooms look multilingual. So it kind of developed across the career. And we had a multilingual maths week, which was really interesting, organized by the head of maths. So that was part of it. But the other was the carousel of languages, which by then we knew the national curriculum was kicking in and that they wouldn't be able, they would have to do a language for 5 years. So we pushed it. We did 4 languages in between September and Christmas, and they did French, German, Greek, and Turkish, all of them. And then they could choose which one they were going to do in January. So that was a bit frantic and always a bit stressful. But we did end up with quite a lot of monolingual English speakers choosing Greek or Turkish, interestingly. And we did a bit of research with them and why. And they said, well, because we hear it in the streets, or we can practice with our friends, you know, that. So things like that. Interestingly, a lot of those then, we gave them the option of doing another language on top of that in the second year. And a lot of those then chose French and German on top of their Greek or Turkish. Mm. So that's where I realized that multilingualism and helping learners to be aware of the value of our diversity as a resource actually was beneficial for everybody and a motivator for language learning anyway. So that was my take on language awareness, was trying languages.
Okay.
And being, because I knew in the schools where, you know, they'd been put into the French class or put into the Italian class. And after a few weeks, they're all saying, why am I doing French? They're having more fun in Italian, you know, and it was always the grass is greener on the other side. So the idea of letting them try and then choose. I didn't know it was about autonomy, of course, but that's what we did. Yeah, so that was the language awareness multilingual side of my work.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wish we could spend longer on it, Terry, but perhaps we could move to the next phase. Obviously, you got an impressive platform of classroom experience when you moved on to onto other things. I mean, looking back, from not just from that perspective and teacher training, but obviously you're very active with ALL in particular and local authorities as well. Over the last 20, 30 years or so, what, in your perception, what have been the things that have been successful in language teaching? I think we should say specifically in England, although other parts of the UK there will be similar themes now, no doubt. What do you see? What do you think has largely been successful, and what's largely been unsuccessful? And you might want to venture a reason why, or not venture a reason why.
It's hard to say that anything's been successful given the state we're in at the moment, to be honest. The areas that, you know, I mean, I didn't find a lot of sort of ups or, you know, in the 90s, to be honest. I mean, everybody was just focusing on how they managed to address the national curriculum and how many pieces of evidence they needed to show that the kids had reached level 2 or something or other. So, but so for me, I suppose it was the 2000s. There was the Nuffield inquiry, you know, this kind of sudden interest in multilingualism as well, but also in curriculum that was a bit more inspiring. I became president of ALL, was it 2001, I think it was. And so that's why I ended up on the National Languages Steering Group for the National Languages Strategy. And I found a lot of that national language strategy was working well up to 2010. I think it needed longer to settle in, but the primary, for example, there, people laughed because, you know, there was an aspiration that all children would be doing a language in primary school by 2010, I think it was. And this was 2002 when it came out. Well, that's not very ambitious, but actually by 2010, there were, I think 90% of schools were offering languages in what seemed to be a sort of robust way and not just, you know, and because all of those routes and the work, you know, from SILT had made sure that the teacher education dimension was there and the different strategies they used to achieve that. So you know, I think if that had continued, then we'd be in a better place. In terms of the valuing of multilingualism, of course, we had the revisiting of graded objectives and the guides of the national of the languages ladder. What Cathy Ashton and you remember, Alan, called there were either swimming certificates or skiing certificates. I suspect swimming certificates. And she came to a meeting and said, "I know what we need in languages. We need swimming certificates." And said, "Why, Cathy?" She said, "Because my children can, you know, do a length and get a certificate." And everybody said, "Oh, you mean graded objectives?"
Yeah.
Remember that. So it was, but I mean, what was particularly important to me about that was the fact that they were available in, I think it was 24, 25 languages.
Something like that, yeah.
So, you know, there were languages like Yoruba that I'd never, you know, Somali that had never had accreditation, that were able to, and that accreditation counted in the league tables. It had points. So schools were quite keen on.
So there were several things in the period from 2000 to 2010, which were promising developments.
Yes, yeah.
And might well have gone further had the opportunity. Apart from the ones you've mentioned, what developments in that period do you think were promising for the future, but for various reasons did not?
Well, I think the curriculum that was developed for the diploma, 14 to 19 diploma.
Yeah. Would you like to elaborate on that? Because I know you played a key role in that.
Yeah. Well, I was appointed to lead that. So that's what I spent 2 years of my life doing, at least. And I mean, it had its downsides because, of course, it was the stage 4 after all of the other vocational, more vocational oriented diplomas. And it was something that, you know, you committed to for a large chunk of the week. So that was a bit of a problem. But in terms of the curriculum and the diversity of the curriculum of that diploma, it was, I think, quite groundbreaking. I mean, they had the idea of applied learning. So it was a great discipline to think about the potential, how we give learning meaning to for students to be able to, you know, attach themselves to and to be motivated by. And so, for example, when I talk about this, I usually think about, you know, they would read a book or watch a film, and so they would still do literature, they would do poetry, they would do all these things, but they might write a review of it for a magazine or something, you know, or they'd write about the character, but for a magazine article. So it had a kind of, in their heads, they could see themselves doing it rather than it just being a sort of academic essay that they might not connect.
So it had actually a purpose.
Yeah, so, and that had to inform our thinking with everything. So I think together, all of that really would have changed the way in which people think about what they're learning in school, whatever subject it was, but I think particularly in languages. That was one of the things. And of course, there was a module in learner autonomy where they would choose any language that they wanted. They had to have a reason for it, but it could be a language spoken in the class or something else. They had to justify why. And then they would learn to set targets and do things. And the assessment of that was through a portfolio, reflective portfolio, a portfolio of evidence, but a reflective one. And that was scaffolded using kind of learner autonomy things. So the idea was that we don't know which languages people will need in the future. So if they learn to reflect more consciously about how they learn languages, then you know, they'll be able to apply themselves rather than what I always felt was, you know, if they were offered a job and they were asked to learn Arabic, they'd say, oh no, I was rubbish at languages at school. My vision for teaching languages was that they would say, oh, okay, then fine, as long as you pay for the course. You know, I mean, that was, and so that I had that in mind. And they were learning about multilingualism as well, because, you know, it was a large chunk of the week. There were quite a number of modules, and there was vocational language, but they did do 2 languages as well as this can't remember what we called it. Yeah, the sort of the autonomous learning module, as some of them called it. So, but I think it was the content and this idea that they always, the other idea was that they would never just learn language for its own sake. They would always learn something through the language. So it connected with CLIL in a way. So the language modules, and there were 3 of them, they had to think about, you know, when you were teaching it, what they're going to learn that is not just a grammatical structure. They would learn the grammatical structures, but that, you know, thinking about what they would learn. And again, you know, I mean, my PhD, of course, was in autonomy and motivation. So after all of my thing, experience, but you know, just children saying, well, you know, we don't want to talk about our pets. I'm 14, you know, I mean, and say what colour they are. You know, so it was that kind of the idea of learning a language to learn something else as well. So it was integrated to make it meaningful.
Yeah.
And that was very much part of the diploma. And you know, by the time we finished, and of course the consultation was huge because there was a lot of funding attached, unlike the consultations we've had since then, and the changes in curriculum. You know, I mean, I had a whole team of people. There were researchers from Warwick that did a lot of the research to form it. And we, you know, we consulted, we had kind of a steering group, but we also had these other groups, higher education, employers, learners, teachers, and they were very, very excited by it. They you know, because they listened carefully to it. Unlike when I had the meeting with Nick Gibb, when we knew there was going to be an election, you know, and they're going to Purda, and then suddenly we were encouraged to speak to the opposition in case they win, to try and, I mean, that was a hopeless case, wasn't it? And he would literally, and I, you know, I thought it was an urban myth, but he literally asked, but when would they learn the pluperfect? And they won't learn to read, will they? And I said, but they'll be doing more reading than they've ever done in our curricula. Yeah, but and what, they won't learn the grammar. I said, well, there's a linguistics module where they look at language and how it's used. I mean, there's, you know, and how, and they will learn how to analyze sentences.
Yeah.
You know,
perhaps I can just interrupt a second, because
exactly.
some of our listeners and viewers may not know who you're talking about. You're talking about an education minister, aren't you, Terry?
Yes, yeah, he wasn't the secretary, he was the schools minister at the time.
Yeah.
Minister of State.
Yeah.
And,
not the minister, but one of the ministers. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So, and I had a meeting with him, and actually, I think all of the shadow. I mean, it was a diploma meeting, but I was representing the what do we call them? Like the stage 4, which was the languages, humanities, and sciences, and then there were people for the other 3 stages. And we had this meeting, but they clearly weren't very interested, and they didn't want. They called it vocational, and I said, but it's not vocational. It's meant to lead to academic. You know, you continue in academia or in employment. So it has the academic and the, you know, the vocational, but they're sort of intermingled in a very interesting way. And it said, but we don't want that. I won't say what they called it, but it was a bit rude. But they said, you know, they were already mentioned the technical. We want the academic. We want the technical.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, the old distinction between the vocational and the academic, and the, yeah, it's part of the way in which languages, as well as other subjects, of course, but is in a sense politicized. It's never really something that's unpoliticized from our perspective in the wrong ways, what you're implying.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we've never really managed, have we, with vocational education anyway, because it's always been seen, compared with Germany, for example, you know, there's a whole route of education that people follow. But that it was just a very depressing and very interesting, but depressing. And of course, then it was cancelled. But we just put out a call for people to apply in consortia to pilot it, the diploma. It was approved by Ofqual 2010. And we put out this call, and we'd had I can't remember exactly, but it must have been 30 different consortia wanting to do it. And a consortium would be of schools so that they could offer more languages, but also maybe business, universities, you know, it was a real consortium, employers. And I looked at those, they were amazing. You know, the things that were in there, in those schools that they wanted to try. Because, you know, people could interpret it, it was there, but people, it needed, you know, people could draw on their local context in order to be able to do it. So it was such a shame and such a loss. And then to find myself invited a few months later, you know, to an advisory group of one of the exam boards that I was on, where it all started by, you know, we had to talk in groups about what would innovation be in language teaching? What would you do if you could do whatever you liked? And it was totally demoralizing. No, and I mean, I just kind of had to withdraw a bit because it was as though nothing had happened. You know, there were people that just totally, I call it collective amnesia, you know, that just as though things had not happened, things had not existed. It was very bizarre. And then, of course, that continued, and we had people calling for, oh, what we need is a national languages strategy. And
Can I just
sir.
Thinking about our viewers and listeners, so just so that they can, as it were, look back and the exact reference. So it was the diploma. We talked about the diploma, but Terry, give us the kind of official designation of what you've been talking about.
It was the 14 to 19 diploma in languages and international communication.
Interesting title, wasn't it? International communication.
Yes, yeah. Interestingly, we actually wanted it to be intercultural communication, which you'd be very interested in, Mike. But it was felt that that wouldn't necessarily be a seller because people wouldn't know what intercultural. So international communication was the one that was preferred.
Well, while we've on the word international, I think it might be appropriate to move to the fourth part of this, the language scene in other countries, and your take on that. But I'll hand over to Mike to lead on that one.
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, I would be interested to talk about intercultural as opposed to international, but let's move on to international in the other sense. I mean, we know that you were very much involved in FIPLV. Perhaps I should again specify what that, or we should specify what that is. Fédération Internationale de Professeurs de Langues Vivantes, if I remember rightly. You tell us a bit about that and how you got involved and what that meant for you personally, given perhaps, a moment ago you talked about how things were demoralizing. Was FIPLV something that brought a different perspective?
Well, at the time, I mean, I first became involved with them in about 2004, I think. Roughly about the same time, I think, that I started to go to ECML as well, because when I became president, I think it was 2004, 5. I had been to ECML before, but yeah, I must have done, because when I became president, we moved the official address from Australia to ECML, which is where it still is. So,
ECML being the European Centre for Modern Languages in Graz. Yeah, sorry, but just to make these things explicit. Yeah.
Of the Council of Europe, we ought to add as well.
Of the yeah.
That's right. So the work at that time, the work I was doing with FIPLV or FIPLV or FIPLV, depending on where you are, and ECML moving forward, was for me, it complemented the work I was doing in the UK. I think since 2010, it's been something to make me feel better, because I became so disillusioned by languages education in this country with the government that took over, and just the way this amnesia. I mean, I remained involved to a certain extent, but I found that the work I was doing internationally and in European work was, I could be far more forgiving of things, and I could address things much more than I could closer to home. So, I mean, FIPLV, I became president then. I was president for 3 terms, which is 9 years. At which point I became Secretary General for a term, 3 years. Realized I couldn't do that because that was too much. So became Vice President. I mean, there was quite a turnover, so I carried on because there'd been a big turnover in people. And my period of Vice President was included lockdown, the pandemic. And so I'm president again because I decided to stand again as president to try and bring it back to life. And I've got a new invigorated exec, and we're now back. But during the pandemic, we weren't doing things that we could have done because people were ill or busy or whatever. So I don't know how long I will I'll stay doing it now because it's been a long time. But I am president at the moment again. And
in terms of perspective that gives you perspective on languages in England and or the UK, but also internationally, how do you see languages teaching now?
Well, the FIPLV perspective for me helps me to understand the problem of English. Even though I once talked about English being a problem in a European Commission meeting, and said, no, it's not a problem, it's beautiful. I said, I know it's lovely, and I love English, of course, but in terms of many other languages, it is. And so, I mean, I did a survey. I'm going to redo the survey because I've not done one since 2010 of FIPLV members or associations, of which there are hundreds. And we got returns from nearly 100. And one of the things that came out was the issue of English being a challenge for other languages, not just in Europe, but around the world. It kind of sort of like the Argentina and Brazil, and the Portuguese in Argentina they're not doing it because English is pushed so much, but things like that, really. So all around the world, but then also the similarities between the Anglophone countries, which of course are amongst the most multilingual countries. If we think about Australia, the States, the UK, New Zealand, very multilingual. Doing a lot of things, some of them now around multilingualism, as we were as well, but still, fighting this battle really in terms of motivation to learn other languages. So I think that was helpful. I think I know I brought that to meetings in the 2000s, even before I'd done that survey, because when I was in meetings where people would say, but why can't we do it when the Swedes do it and the Dutch do it so well and learn other languages? And so, well, if you remove English isn't even a foreign language in Sweden; it's a separate stream. and already French
Yeah.
was their jobs because they weren't doing the optional, because they, Norway, for example, they reduced the curriculum, and then it became optional, and they just weren't doing it. So if you take English out of England, yeah, we're not doing well in languages. If you take English out of Norway or Sweden, they're not doing that great either. So, it's just, which is why I think, it's English is the problem in a way. But it's there to stay, of course, so we always have to think around that and find other ways. And I think, I found ways around it in multilingual schools those decades ago. So, and it's a bit frustrating that those were kind of starting feeding into curriculum, but no longer are. But, I now lead the training and consultancy program that is co-funded by the European Centre for Modern Languages and the European Commission, so the European Union. For those people that think it's the same, it isn't. The European Union is not the Council of Europe. And so this is, it's co-funded, and it has been since 2015, and it continues to be renewed. And we do 2-day workshops called Supporting Multilingual Classrooms. And it's very exciting to go to places which may not have yet the diversity that we might find in Sheffield or London, but where they're wanting to do something, and they're aware that things are changing and they might need to. So I did a workshop in Montenegro, and it was such a positive, this was in May, it was such a positive experience because they kept saying, well, we don't have a lot. But they were really interested and open to it. And of course, the Ukraine war galvanized interest as well. So the first face-to-face one I did after the lockdown period when they were online was in Slovakia, the Slovak Republic. Not that, just a couple of months after the war started. So, the Slovak Republic, of course, was on the front line. And they were very motivated about how to include those children. And it was a sort of a bridge to saying, well, you also have a lot of children that have been coming over from Syria places over the last years, and which they hadn't thought about. I think the fact that Ukraine was so close to home got them thinking about inclusion and linguistic inclusion more broadly rather. And so the curriculum there's always, nearly always, there's people in there from the ministry, from that come and join in, and we had people that were rewriting curriculum in there, and so it's kind of really informing curriculum development. Slovenia is another one, they're really embracing the plurilingual aspects. So we've got things developing from probably, they're all very different, all of the workshops are different, but generally maybe a kind of lower base than what we had, but which are really, starting to think about things. But, politics gets in the way. And at the moment, in 2 weeks' time, I'm doing a workshop in Brussels and fighting to, it's called Supporting Multilingual Classrooms, but I have to pretend it's all about Dutch. Which and it's called Dutch by them now, interestingly, rather than Flemish, because the government it's the year of the Dutch language, and the government's planning to forbid use of other languages in playgrounds. So, and because it's high level and it's a government department basically, so things that go out can't be seen to be doing everything around plurilingualism. But then they said, but what happens in the workshop? is up to you. So it's very interesting because, so, you know, it's working with people who are having these requirements on them. And there I'll be working with people who are in the reception classes, people coming from overseas, that they then will be teaching Dutch to, where they're not encouraged to use other languages. And of course, in our workshops, we talk about how they bring their languages to the learning of the language of schooling, rather than, you know, they don't need to forget them, they actually bring what they do. So that's what we'll be doing. And we will be doing stuff around supporting them with learning the language, with learning Dutch, of course, but not in a monolingual way, in a plurilingual way. But, you know, I mean, I've worked in other contexts like that. And usually the participants are very open and you know, interested, and do things, because it's followed up 6 months late, you know, afterwards. And so it's I've always loved being in other countries, going back to the start, you know. So it's hard on top of a full-time job doing other stuff in Westminster. But, you know, I have to make time and just work more. But I just love spending those days with people and kind of understanding what's happening in the schools and learning from them and sharing things that are happening in other countries, that, you know, and real people, teachers. So I just find that is what keeps me going, and the FIPLV as well. I don't do a lot of language work in Westminster. It's not really part of my job, though I do have a project called the Multilingual University, because we're meant to be the most, we are the most diverse university by some measures. That's what we are, the most diverse university in London, which I suppose would make us, you know, certainly one of the most in the country, if not in Europe. And we do an awful lot, diversity and inclusion, decolonizing. I lead research groups looking at you know, education research, because we don't have an education department. So developing education research into things like the awarding gap and decolonizing. But you talk about languages, and it's very hard for people to connect that to the idea of equality, diversity, and inclusion, and decolonizing. Even though I say, well, English is a colonial language. I mean, that's if we're going to colonize. So I'm doing something there in the university as well, which is we're just doing a survey, because we've no idea what languages bringing. So you know, it's that multilingualism, the sort of all of that I'm passionate about. So I'll keep on doing that.
So in a sense, there are two threads. There's your interest and your love of being in other countries, meeting other people, and so on. And then there's this thread of multilingualism in England or in Britain, as well as elsewhere, which seem to run through. And it's nice that I was about to say, kind of bring us back to the beginning, but you did that yourself a moment ago by saying you love doing these workshops on top of everything else that you do, because it takes you to other countries and other people. Well, I don't know, perhaps we need to round off, but maybe there's something, if there's anything that you think we should round off with, apart from what I've just said. I mean, in one sense, because we're focusing above all, not only, but above all on language teaching in the UK, my impression is that you've been rather disappointed, shall we say, over time, but you found then this complementarity and other ways of thinking about things elsewhere, and maybe who knows, that may change. And that language teaching is inevitably politicized, and
Yeah.
we don't know what will happen if and when we have new governments and so on. And to be a bit more optimistic, perhaps.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, I suppose, after so many decades, you start to imagine that things will get better, because they've got worse, they've got better, they've got worse, and surely they're going to get better. So that brings some optimism, although this is carrying on rather a long time, I have to say, this current situation. And so I have been thinking about this recently, and I've written articles around thinking about Freire, and talk about spaces of hope, because what I've realized is that much as that government support for languages in the 2000s was brilliant, and we could do so much and make so much progress in terms of thinking around languages and strategy more broadly about how languages are offered. When the government changes, it all goes. So we can't rely on that at all. And I've always done work with supplementary schools. And, since I came to London, I work when I'm in London, I have a flat in Barking. So I've been working closely with communities in Barking and Dagenham, in particular the Albanian community, but also Turkish, and the supplementary schools, and also in Newham. And just seeing the way that they, despite all of the constraints that they face in terms of funding and where to meet, and I mean, this has changed in Barking. This wonderful school, it used to be the largest primary school in the country on the Gascoigne estate, which was a bit of a notorious estate, that used to host the supplementary schools. The head teacher was really committed, and since lockdown, the schools have not been able to meet there, and I've not managed to find out what's gone on and why. Because it used to be about finances and things, and they'd have to pay the caretaker for a Saturday to open the school and those sorts of things. So they face these constraints, which seem to be getting worse. Accreditation issues generally, but they carry on, and they work together. They support one another. As an academic, I've been trying to bring together my two fields, because I felt that I couldn't cope with two different learner autonomy and multilingualism. And so I wrote this publication about the idea of collective autonomy, and I looked at literature across disciplines, because I'm an interdisciplinary professor here at Westminster. So I looked across disciplines, human geography, local government, at this concept in relation to resistance and social justice. And so I now sort of seeing this collective autonomy that the schools, those supplementary schools, are, despite all of the constraints, managing to make sure that their languages are maintained and learned and carried on. And they do that. So, but what I'm very interested in moving forward is, again, thinking back to my experiences in London, where giving people the opportunity to learn Greek and Turkish got them motivated to learn French or German. How the supplementary schools themselves can make a case for multilingualism and plurilingualism with the broader community, because at the moment they're little islands, but how to do that, and some are already doing that. They're lobbying. The Albanian community has been lobbying for years, and has spoken in the APPG in the House of Lords, about for accreditation, because they've never had it. So there's this resistance as well, and I talk about critical autonomy, which is about despite all the constraints, we can still do something, find the spaces for maneuver, and they're doing that. So how we kind of use that bottom-up energy to bring about change on a broader level, I think is what I want to kind of carry on exploring.
Well, that's a good note to finish on, I think. That's a great note to finish on, in fact. Yeah, thank you very, very much, Terry.
Thanks, Terry. Very good. Thank you.
It's a pleasure inviting me, and thanks for doing this.